أهلا وسهلا جميعا يلي انضموا إلينا اليوم. أول شيء إن شاء الله كلكم مرتاحين ببيروت. استمتعتوا بالمتحدثين والنقاش اللي كان عنا إياه امبارح. رح نحكي اليوم باللغة الإنجليزية ديمقراطيا مثل ما حكينا مع المتحدثين الأربعة. So we will switch to English. Whoever is online can actually click on the interpretation button, and we have simultaneous interpretation for the whole day, including in the room as well. Okay, so I think most of you know me by now. I'm Sarine Karageorgian. I'm the program director of the Environmental Politics Program at the Arab Reform Initiative. I'm very happy to be moderating this session today. Just to recap a few points that we discussed yesterday, we had a long, three very engaging discussions on just transition, water injustice, and food sovereignty. Some of the main points that we discussed and we raised internally with our audience, whether online and even here in the audience, it was more like, how do we build coalitions? And we've seen that we lack strong solidarity movements in the region. This was one of the output of yesterday, and we will be discussing this again tomorrow during our workshop. Two, we discussed about the role of the state, that is controlling and specifically access to water, and we've discussed this in Tunisia and Iraq and other parts of the region. And three, we looked at different, how do you build coalition? What does food sovereignty mean? What is the role of the farmers? And how they should be integrated in the decision-making process from the beginning until the end. We looked at there's a lot of technical solutions, and we're lacking, politics is really essential in every decision that we take, and we have to talk about the politics and the different role of the different stakeholders. So today, our panel is about the Gulf transitions. And as you know, the Gulf or the Gulf countries, such as the KSA, UAE, and Qatar, they have this strategy for the next, for KSA, for example, it's to 2030, the Green Initiative. For UAE, it's 2050, the green strategy to having clean energy, and 50% will be used on clean energy. Qatar is building the largest solar city. What are these implications? What does it mean for internally and externally for the citizens living and also the different people living in these different countries? What does it mean for the social or an economic rentier economic type of society, and what is the impact on the social classes within these countries and also on the labor market? And today with us we have four experts who have lived in the Gulf. Actually, the four of you have lived in the Gulf, and we're very delighted to having you with us. So without further ado, I will be introducing Crystal, who is on our left. Crystal is a scholar of global political economy and university lecturer in political economy of the Middle East at Leiden University in Leiden, in the Netherlands. Her research examines labor and migration governance, job seeking, and economic belonging, and the political economy of dependency on hydrocarbon, revenue, and foreign labor in Gulf countries. The second speaker with us is Mohammed Al-Saidi. Mohammed is an assistant professor of public policy in the Department of International Affairs at Qatar University. He has worked on projects and published papers on Yemen, the Gulf, East Africa, and Jordan on issues ranging from development and the environment to water resources, management, and sustainable transitions. Our third speaker is Camille. Camille now lives in Beirut, but he's a policy advisor, and he has been acting as a policy advisor in sustainable urban development for over 10 years. He has concentrated his efforts on promoting climate action within the government of Dubai. And our last speaker today is Manal Shehabi. Is an applied economist with recognized energy expertise, economic and resource sustainability in resource exporters, focusing on the Middle East. She's an academic advisor at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, and founding director of Shear Research and Advisory. She's also a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and research associate of Economic Research Forum. So we'll start with Crystal, and then we'll have a different discussions with the four panelists.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thank you very much to Ari for inviting me here, and everyone for the really stimulating discussion we had yesterday. So in my intervention today, and in opening the panel, I guess, I want to make one central but very simple argument to start our conversation about energy transitions and just transitions in the region. So our conversations about labor or of people have to include the environment, and our conversations about the environment have to center humans. That is, we need to return to that original meaning of just transition that Katie introduced yesterday morning. So this applies when we speak about the energy-dependent Gulf economies, a space in which I find the conversation is also often isolated into silos. So I make this point over 3 key points, but first I thought I'll contextualize a little bit the region because I'm opening the panel, and the country in which I'll focus my comments are Oman. So situated at the heart of the world's largest oil-producing region and regional capital flows, and drawing on workforces from global supplies of labor, Khaleesi countries are embedded within this global economy that is transforming through a lot of processes: globalization, digitalization, these energy transitions, changing oil markets, and also the expansion of South-South migration. But neither of these processes can be viewed in isolation. They remain extraordinarily, we're talking about energy transitions, but this region remains extraordinarily dependent on hydrocarbon revenue in terms of the percentage of national income and also the percentage of exports, in which the region ranges from something like 30% in UAE to nearly 70% or more in Saudi Arabia. And GCC countries are also among the highest energy consumers in the world, alongside countries like the United States and Canada, important to keep in mind. And these countries are hugely dependent on foreign labor, where expats comprise between 45 and 95% of labor forces. So I use Oman as an example, and I think it's interesting because it's quite different than the ones that you even centered in many ways at the beginning of the conversation. And I view it as a valuable case because it's under-researched somewhat, and also because it's viewed as a laboratory of reform in the Gulf, because Oman, like Bahrain, must prepare for a post-oil future sooner than its neighbors. So in Oman, crude oil, petroleum gas, refined oil constitutes also around 65–66% of exports. And its labor market is similarly fragmented, a little bit less so, but still, where 76% of employment in Oman is in the private sector, fewer than 13% of working Omanis are working in the private sector. And the remainder work in the public sector, in government, state-owned enterprises, etc. That's 10.5% of the work in the country available is in the public sector, and that sector is even smaller than the household or domestic work sector. And at the same time, job seeking or unemployment, but the preferred term in the region is بحثون عن عمل, is one of the biggest social policy, public policy issues. And that became especially apparent to many observers in 2011 when Oman had its own kind of uprising. So the ILO suggests youth unemployment in Oman is around 13 to 14%. The World Bank estimates it's around 49%. So we have a wide range of interpretations of unemployment and youth unemployment, but it is a pressing public policy issue. Yet in a divided labor market where the minimum wage only applies to citizens and salaries are based on varying reservation wages of home states, labor markets are very segmented. So I make the argument that I'm forwarding in 3 key steps. So the first one is that this conversation about environmental change and just transitions that we're having have to center this conversation of labor. And I mean this in the economic and social sense, where labor equal human beings, but also in a sense that's inclusive of productive and reproductive labor. Too often, I think this narrative of energy transition fails to include it or only puts it as a tangential demographic statistic on the side. And the environmental and consequences of human decisions need to involve the communities in which they occur. So the second step of this is, in an energy transition, like all transitions, they have real consequences for the nature of industry and also the forms of work that unfold. So we need to think about this transition, I think, in the context of these discussions around the future of work, but also in historical experience, a recent historical experience. So the contingent workforce in the Gulf, it precedes this rise of digital economy, future of work conversations we're having. And both of these trends have potentially strong consequences for labor, and they exacerbate these trends that we see in the region of precarity, temporality, of outsourcing of work. Contemporary history offers us some examples to support my argument. We can look at some recent history and the impact on labor. So in the pursuit of economic diversification, industrialization, and growth over the last several decades, and the spatial and economic transformations that we viewed, they have impact on the environment, on communities, on their health, and on their livelihoods, all wrapped into one. And I like to use this example from Sohar in Oman. It's a community I lived in for many years in the mid-2000s. And at that time, Sohar was undergoing a rapid transformation from a small town to a city. And at the time, people were always saying, you know, Sohar will be the next Dubai. We're going to be the new Dubai of the region. This was the sense. And it was talk of all the possibilities, a refinery, a port, in Lua, the Sohar industrial area, all of these major industrial developments that were promising jobs and trickle-down economic benefits for society, for the population that was there. And this promise was constantly likened to Dubai, which was just a 2-hour drive down the highway. Expectations were very high. A lot of jobs did come from this. The government invested in productive sectors and downstream activities, et cetera, et cetera. But a majority of these jobs went to foreign recruitment. By 2011, Sohar was also a central city in protests during the Omani uprising. And the demands were for jobs, but also for environmental justice. And this is a note that's often forgotten. So during this industrial development, residents of Lua, a town adjacent to Sohar and where the port is located, during this whole time, their residents were filing lots of complaints about the environmental degradation of the coastal town, from the port, from dumping, from nearby industries, complaints about damaged fisheries, unexplained illness, and all of this. And these communities too, joined the protests during that period in 2011 and in 2012. So I raise this point not to point out a history of contestation or talk about political contention in the region that we often don't talk about, but actually to point out this intersection of environmental and labor considerations, this intersection of justice and perceptions of justice. And so for policymakers, it points to the necessity to have inclusive processes in these plans of transition, and that should be applied to the current shift that we're talking about. Often policymakers fail to include local communities, or even when they include them, they come up with the wrong solutions because they don't engage with what the communities themselves want. In Oman as well, you saw this recently in Duqm, where they developed housing units for some of the local Bedouin population that many didn't even want to move into because these were not the kind of solution they were desiring for themselves. So my final point, the third step, is these impacts do not stay nationally limited. Gulf labor markets, like I mentioned, they're intensely global, and the transitions that reshape the nature of work and jobs available impact citizens and also non-citizens in the labor market. And by connection, their economic and environmental imprints on their homeland and on the regional sphere in the wider Middle East and a global sphere. As well. So what seems nationally limited has regional, global implications for the environment and for labor too. And a lot of times our conversations in the national sphere only include, you know, national labor, citizen labor, what do we do for locals in our own community? Or on the other side, we only focus on expatriate labor, human rights discussions, etc. And little conversation between the two. But the implications for national labor and in thinking about inclusive and just transition, we need to recognize that, like any transition, it will have very human implications on individuals working in the region and then necessarily their families, communities, their nations at home. So Middle Eastern labor sending states like Egypt, like Lebanon, but also South and Southeast Asian states like Sri Lanka, India, et cetera, are impacted by the choices and by the transitions that occur. So the labor, like environmental outcomes, are connected in a global ecosystem. And you can see, for example, the exacerbation of crises when remittance flows contract during periods of economic contraction. You saw that in the global financial crisis in Dubai, where the economic impact was felt very strongly in places like Kerala and other places in the region. So we need to ensure that this transition is not offloaded onto poor or offloaded onto poorer regions or poorer countries in the region. And it's easy to ignore when it's offshored because of the context of the labor market. So I think that within the discussion in the region, the so-called easy solution is to train citizens into high-skilled green industries that can populate these advanced digital automated spaces, and these will require fewer labor imports from abroad, et cetera, et cetera. But this dream, however real or unrealistic, we can have that discussion later, ignores the regional and also the global justice considerations. So I think any of these conversations have to include that. And there's lots more we can say about global emissions and consumption footprints, but I leave that to my colleagues. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I think it was a great intervention, and thank you for reminding us of the intersection of global justice and the justice word that comes for labor markets and also for citizens and non-citizens living in Oman and other parts of the Gulf countries. On this, we will continue with Muhammad. Yes, we will put the slides. Yes, we'll give you the mic. Maybe you can talk this also on the water energy nexus that you have also worked, and the future of the post-oil. That would be interesting as well.
I'll try to play a magician.
Oh, yeah. It's online.
Okay. So, okay. I don't think I can do this, but do it like this. How can you? Okay. First, second. Okay. Okay. No, I think I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Start. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you a lot. It was really fascinating, Crystal, to have this really very fascinating case study of Oman, also this perspective on labor market. I'm going rather to talk about the energy transition in a broader sense. So I have two main topics. First, I'm going to really introduce this energy transition. And I am arguing it's a significant economic happening. Later, I'm talking about the implications of this energy transition, arguing that we don't know this yet, whether it will be successful or not. So if we look at the energy transition, you see here some slides. We have, in the Middle East, energy subsidies are 50% of energy subsidies worldwide, of pre-tax subsidies. Energy subsidies in high-income countries, such as the Gulf, subsidizing the price, have been for long being criticized as a part of the rentier states, ripe for reform, and so on. We have significant, you see it in this figure, we have actually since 2014, the decline of the oil price, we have significant cuts in subsidies across the Gulf countries. For example, in Saudi Arabia, this year, Saudi Arabia saved $40 billion in energy subsidy reduction in comparison to 2014. This is $40,000 billion that you have, that you didn't have before, that you can invest in renewable energy, you can invest in diversification. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the biggest economy in the Gulf. But even for biggest economy in the Middle East, but even for very, very big economies, even for Germany, if we have $40 billion every year, and imagine in 10 years how much, in 20, these are significant revenues. Okay, the energy subsidy reforms, you can see here also the rate of subsidy has been slashed significantly. For example, Saudi Arabia, it was 9%. We were spending in the Gulf more for energy subsidies than for health, for education, even for military. Energy subsidy was the main spending, maybe even more than capital spending in some countries. It has been cut by, for Saudi Arabia, it's around 4% now. I think now it's 3.6% of GDP. This is still much higher than China, for example, in Iran, but it is cut significantly. The energy subsidy was pushed through despite or with no significant opposition. There are many publications on why. One part of it is the Arab Spring, and people were willing to trade political stability for reduction subsidy reforms. And the energy subsidies, this is the next slide. The energy subsidies, we should see it within a broader environmental sustainability. I call it environmental awakening in the Gulf. Whether it is true or not, whether it will be successful or not, we will see. But we have the Gulf countries, they are more interested in sustainability. There's a very, very famous journal paper I always used. It's the title is Striving for No. Saudi Arabia was always striving for no in climate negotiations. This is not the case anymore. We have also investment in renewables, significant investment in renewables. Also, many of the Gulf countries are engaged in these global networks. Whether the global environmental governance, whatever you think about it, but they are more engaged. We have green ministries. We have climate change ministry last year in Qatar. This is significant. And so on. The Global Green Growth Institute is present now in Qatar, and so on. These are not always North institutions. They are also a part of the global environmental governance. Okay, so you see it is top-down transition. It is a top-down transition, and I come to the next point, or the second topic. What are the outcomes of this transition? I have 3 points to judge here, what are for me important. First, the ability to achieve financial sustainability, to free revenues for export. I think this will be the case. This energy transition is not a matter of luxury. It must happen for countries such as Saudi Arabia. There are some publications, I'm not sure if you, Manal, will agree with this as an applied economist, but there are some publications that say Saudi Arabia by 2030, if they continue like this, with this very high energy, per capita usage, low efficiency, and domestic demand increasing by 2030, they cannot export anymore. Maybe this is very simplistic, but we have these publications. So it's not Mohammed bin Salman. It has to happen. It has to happen whether by him or somebody else. For countries such as Oman and Bahrain, it was mentioned, we need to have energy reforms, and we expect these energy reforms to free some or to save the export revenues. This is very relevant for diversification efforts in the Gulf. Although diversification, there are also many publications on this, they depend on the energy price. Now the energy price is very high, maybe diversification will go down. This has been. It's also not only important for the region, it's also important for the wider region. We see it now in the Ukraine crisis, where revenues, higher revenues from energy can help physical stability in countries such as Egypt. This crisis is really real, especially in countries where they have very high food subsidy program and so on. Okay, the second point, participation. What is the outcome in participation? Yeah, the participation, private sector participation, yes. If we see the model for the energy transition, it is through independent water and energy suppliers. So private sector with the government building desalination plant or joint desalination electricity plants, and they get some form of subsidy through the fuel price. Yeah. So we have increased private sector participation. It is seen as a part of the diversification efforts of the Gulf. But in the literature, we see it as a part of extending the rentier states, creating more public jobs, but not changing the social contract. Gulf countries are interested in maintaining high level of centralization, maintaining control, and offering new opportunities instead of subsidy to the prices, direct subsidies, or through lavish public jobs. And if you look at how the energy transition is happening, it is through utility scale. So we don't have distributed energy, so people cannot put solar energy on the rooftop, and through feed-in tariffs participate. We don't have energy communities. I was talking with Elias on energy democratization. We are very far from this in the Gulf, and no country has even feed-in tariffs or comprehensive energy laws. So it is centralized utility scale, no participation except for private sector. It is highly centralized. So will this transition be successful? Well, I think it might not be a failure, but it might not lead to the outcomes that are promised. Why? Because one of the points is it is top-down. There is no awareness, there is no participation, and there's no cooperation on really highly important issues such as issues that involve the whole Gulf countries. If you look at the Gulf as a water body, it is shared by all Gulf countries. Also Iran and Iraq are participating. And if you look at environmental problems, they are increasing. Salinity is increasing. We have more usage, more coastal development. So it is a common pool resource, as we say in economics, but increasingly becoming common pool. We are not regulating access, but we are actually utilizing more and more. That's why cooperation is very important. And if you look at the infrastructure that we have in the Gulf, they are large scale. Again, highly decentralized, large scale mega project. For example, in desalination, we have 20% of desalination is supplied by 5 plants. Doha is supplied by one side, the whole of Riyadh also from one side. So these mega plants, and the same for aquaculture, for example, food security is now will be also delivered through mega project coastal. Yeah? And so food, energy, and water, and these desalination plants also produce energy, is produced through mega plant coastal, using the Gulf water, also depleting the Gulf, increasing salinity, putting brine there. And we have to tackle them through regional cooperation, and this is highly lacking. And this is very important to increase the resilience. Gulf countries look only at performance. Do we have enough people? If you open the tap, will you have water? But we should also look at risks related to climate change, related to security issues, related to technology dependence, and so on, to lack of awareness also, and how to have resilience on what we call the water, energy, food nexus. And to finish with this, and why is this really important to tackle this integration and to have more decentralization. I'll give you 3 examples. Desalination, I mentioned it, it used a lot of energy. In some countries, 14% of electricity supply goes to desalination. So here, very, very clear link. And we have to move through the energy transition to solar desalination and so on. The other example is district cooling. 70% of energy use in the Gulf is for cooling, and it is supplied through very inefficient system split air conditioner. District cooling promises to lower a lot the energy used for cooling, up to 30%, but it uses water. And this water should come optimally from reused treated wastewater and not from desalinated water and so on. The other example for food security, which is highly important, in Qatar, for example, after the boycott, it has been #1. Very, you can say, securitized, clearly. Greenhouses are very important. For greenhouses, you need more energy. So this energy should come from somewhere, and it should come from clean energy. That's why the energy transition is important. It's important to look at how we deliver this integrated system. And the last point to achieve, to finish with, to achieve the energy transition, I think we need to have science-based evidence. How we solve problems through science-based evidence and not, let's say, mainstreaming solutions. This is, I had a talk with another, and also to re-educate. A sustainability transition is re-educating the Gulf consumer. Awareness is very low. Sustainable development has not reached the common man, and I don't think it will if we continue like this. Maybe some students, we have networks we work in networks of scientists and so on issues related, let's say, herbal medicine, marine, but not really energy, not really consumption and footprint and these kind of issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. I mean, you raised several points. Maybe we'll discuss about it, about decentralization, how when it's a very top-down type of decision-making in the Gulf, specifically KSA and other parts. Also creating public jobs, but no social contracts. What does it mean? What is the impact of that? And I like the energy democratization you compared to Tunisia, and you had this discussion. I think this is what we want to create within these debates, is lessons learned from different parts of the region. We will jump on that since you talked about creating awareness. We will go to Camille, and maybe you can share with us your own opinion, having lived in Dubai, supporting and giving policy advice to the government of Dubai. What does it mean? What is the future of this energy transition? Tfaddal.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. First, Crystal, thank you for mentioning Bahrain and Oman as countries that have to worry earlier about the post-oil future of the region. Dubai also, within the UAE, ran out of oil. Today, it's less than 5%, the oil GDP in Dubai, so let's say it's almost non-existent. And that's what is driving Dubai's early fight for economic diversification. And Mohammed, you talked about environmental awakening in the Gulf. Yes, I think, in my opinion, the approach to environmental policy, it's much more cynical. And I'm a bit less optimistic than you on that. So I worked for 10 years as a policy advisor to the government of Dubai in sustainable urban development. I was overseeing the whole policy cycle, focusing on blockers and obstacles to climate action and to environmental policies. Structural blockers and obstacles. Technical, you mentioned desalination and cooling, the climate, the technology. Technical obstacles are also very important. For example, for desalination, 99% of the water used in Dubai comes from desalination, with no other sources of water, surface water or even rainwater. Precipitation. Desalination water, the desalinated water is produced mostly by cogeneration, which means that a power plant, a thermal power plant, produces waste heat, and it is this waste heat that is used to desalinate water. I'm making it simple. That's one of the limitation for Gulf countries to be more aggressive on renewable renewables, because if they go for renewables, renewable energy will not allow them to desalinate water. So if they phase out their thermal plants, there will be no more water. So this is one of the limitations. Institutional blockers also, and stakeholders, of course, like everywhere you have interest groups, industrial or fossil fuel linked, that are blocking climate action and environmental action in the Gulf. Now it is true that the GCC have improved its perception in terms of mitigation and climate diplomacy. Climate diplomacy, I mean, we see the COPs, the Qatar COP, the Doha COP, and the next COP, the COP28, after the Egypt one that is going to be hosted by the UAE. So this is on the climate diplomacy side. But on mitigation also, they have been very active, reaping the benefits of climate mitigation, because they need, as you said, Mohammed, to decrease their energy costs, but also they need to consume less fossil fuels locally in order to sell more fossil fuels globally. So let's not forget that, and that's the main topic of my intervention. Also, having efficient mitigation action, climate action locally, is used by Gulf countries to improve their bargaining power at the negotiation table in international fora. COPs, G20, where Saudi sits, etc. As high-income countries, they can invest in mitigation action, in technological investment, refurbishing buildings and infrastructure, also R&D. They also can invest in adaptation measures. Lots of developments are actually not labeled as adaptation, but there are lots of things that are being done, like wave breakers, like protection of coastal infrastructures, like improving urban quality of living through shading, through cooling, not district cooling, other types of passive cooling, etc., etc. So yes, they are active and they look good in these on these elements, but in my opinion, economic diversification remain, or the lack of economic diversification remain the main obstacle to these countries becoming climate promoters globally. The economic diversification have more or less failed until now in the Gulf. They started early with what they called an economic diversification in petrochemicals and aluminum. Petrochemicals is, by definition, not a diversification away from fossil fuel extraction. Aluminium is very electricity intensive, and without access to cheap energy, to cheap fossil fuel, you cannot produce competitive aluminium on global markets. The second wave of economic diversification was financial services. First, with Bahrain, that took over Beirut after the Lebanese civil war, then Dubai with the Dubai International Financial Center. Is financial services a genuine and real economic diversification away from fossil fuel? Probably more than petrochemicals and aluminium, but still, as we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis, the Dubai Financial Center was not able to survive without heavy bailout from petrodollars, from oil money coming from the central state and Abu Dhabi. So how much today's financial hub in the Gulf are independent from the fossil fuel economy is arguable. The third wave of economic diversification is tourism. Tourism also is very, very dependent on fossil fuel extraction in the Gulf and access to cheap energy because it's very water intensive. We were talking about hotels, cooling of huge malls. We're talking about golf courses that are green and beautiful. We're talking about swimming pools, fountains. So no, tourism in the Gulf is not a diversification away from fossil fuel. It is not making Gulf countries more independent from fossil fuel extraction. Another attempt to diversify their economies is real estate and city making. Again, real estate and city making have a very high carbon footprint on one hand, and on the second hand, despite all the attempts of building green cities, and including the NEOM city in Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, it will not be, there will not be green cities. Their carbon footprint and dependence on cheap energy and fossil fuel extraction is not going to work, as Dubai did not work as a green city, being independent from fossil fuel. Other economic diversification that came after that are probably sectors that should be looked at more closely and developed towards becoming more independent from fossil fuel extraction, although they are not yet. I'm talking about international trade, light industry, renewable energy, and technology. These failures to diversify their economies, the Gulf economies, led to unsustainability in terms of financial unsustainability, but also environmental unsustainability. You mentioned the very high consumption, energy consumption per capita. They top the numbers in the Gulf of energy consumption per capita, but also waste production and lots of CO2 emissions per capita. So yes, there are relatively small countries, but per capita, they top the numbers. So finally, in conclusion, I would like to say that as rational economic actors, as long as they have not drastically and successfully diversified their economies from fossil fuel extraction, we cannot expect from Gulf countries to be fully on board for policies that will contribute to global energy transition and therefore a decrease in global demand for fossil fuels. So yes, today, Gulf countries are not laggards anymore in terms of climate actions locally, but will remain blockers in terms of climate diplomacy and climate action globally.
Thank you, Camille. I think this was very interesting as well to see your own experience now that you have left UAE and Dubai specifically. So you raise about the issue of local consumption, and this is, I mean, consume less, but yet they're exporting a lot globally. This is one, and then I think we will come back. Mohammed also raised this about the awareness and the consumption. Two is about climate diplomacy. What are their, how are they positioning themselves, you know, in the next, if we can say 10, 15 years when it comes to mitigation and adaptation measures. And the labor, so we will go to the last panelist, and having lived also in Kuwait and, you know, worked also Saudi, and, you know, you can share with us your experiences in Kuwait on the economic and the policies related to labor markets. So Manal, tfadali.
Thank you, Serene, and thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I have one slide to share, and at some point we'll just bring it down. It's actually this one. So I just want to build on pretty much the comments from the previous panelists, because thank you for putting the context really well and make it easy for me to build upon it. But I think just to kind of contextualize a little bit in terms of the energy transition in the Gulf, for the longest time, we really didn't hear about any energy transition projects or any decarbonization projects. It really wasn't until the last few years where we started having these massive renewable, very ambitious renewable energy targets. And each of the state, every single state is very behind the plans. And then last year, as Camille was saying, with COPs, but also announcements for net zero emissions, et cetera, and there's these big plans for energy transition in the region, but I think the energy transition, having kind of looked at it really closely, is not really targeting the local market. It's very much still targeting the export market, very much similar to the oil and gas. And the main interest in that is obviously to protect the export revenue base that will be dwindling from the energy transition globally and the move away from fossil fuel consumption. And that revenue is important to also maintain the social contract and the welfare state that exists. But because there is no focus on the domestic market, even with the increase, or even if the renewable energy plans or targets are all achieved, that's still not going to be enough to decarbonize the local economy. So what that means then, if you don't have changes in behavior, efficiency measures, but also other fossil or fuel switching in local industries, then there's not really going to be actual decarbonization, and the ongoing effects on the environment will continue to take place. And the region is very, very hot. It's increasingly getting hotter. It has impacts on health and productivity, but also on GDP. So then you can imagine the ripple effects that come from that. The second point that I want to say is typically when we think of energy transition, actually, let me go to the economic diversification point, following on what Camille was saying, is if we look at all the visions in the region, we have the Vision 2040 and Vision 2035, etc. They also do not place the environment at the center. A lot of them still, Oman, I think, is the one that actually has the largest emphasis on the environment, but the rest really mention it very briefly without real concrete targets on the environment. So again, the focus is on new industries or even expanding within the energy industries, going into things like hydrogen, for example, also targeted mostly for the export market, but also tourism and other things that Camille had mentioned. But these are still really, I think, in my opinion, pretty much discounting the environment altogether. So there will be implications of that as well. The third point is, if we look at, typically when we think of energy transition effects on just transitions in fossil fuel producers or exporters, we often think about people who will lose their jobs from the fossil fuel industry. But in countries of the Gulf that heavily export oil and gas, but also depend on oil and gas as the main engine of the economy, the effects are actually in all sectors, not just because, exactly as you've mentioned, the new economic diversification industries are linked to oil and gas, but also everything else, even the services industries, even the people's when you go to eat these non-tradables, you go to shop and you go to eat at restaurants, etc. All of that is really being funded by people getting money, really salaries, from different, whether it's the government or other private sector, but also all of that is being funneled through the energy sector. And on the left, I'll draw your attention to the I guess if you're looking, that will be your left. This is results from a study that I did on Kuwait. Kuwait has good data that I had access to on looking at effects of COVID-19 and declines of oil price. So similar shocks, so to speak, to the economy as we would expect from the energy transition. And what we would see is the output of the different sectors under the colors represent various scenarios, but the output of different sectors are also going to increase significantly as a result of oil and gas price decrease, or the global decline in demand for oil and gas exports from the region. So the effects are not just going to be on people working in that sector, they're really going to be across all sectors in the economy. Now to my fourth point, building on that, and that's also building on some of the introduction that Crystal started with, is that these effects are going to be a lot larger on the foreign labor than they will be on the national labor. The reason for that is most of the national labor tend to dominate the public sector, smaller share of the private sector, while the foreign labor in the Gulf dominate mostly the private sector, but also the lower skilled jobs where there's very little social protection. You know, women, for example, a lot of women in domestic labor, but also people who have really very little wages with little protection. And also their existence or residence, so to speak, in the Gulf states is tied to the employer. So if they lose their job because there's not, you know, industries are negatively impacted and they can't hire them, they will lose their job. They will also leave the country. And building on the remittances point that you mentioned as well, Crystal, then that will have, again, ripple effects beyond the region, because the remittances to other countries that are home to foreign labor will decrease, but also if they have to leave, where will they go? They will have to seek employment elsewhere. And then you can also then imagine, you know, we're here in Lebanon, if a lot of the Lebanese working in the Gulf, if a lot of them have to come back, can we really contain them in the existing Lebanese economy? Now to my next point as well, that I also think is a very large impediment in the Gulf market is the pervasiveness of oligopolistic structures in the market. And this is of course, the oil and gas industry and any subsequent energy transition industries, whether it's things focusing on carbon capture or hydrogen or renewable energy, all of that will continue to be centralized and nationally owned, maybe with some parts or participation from the private sector, but generally, let's call it close to a monopoly, but put that on the side. All the other industries are also very highly oligopolistic. And what I mean by that is if you, for example, go to the communications industry, there will be maybe two firms that are pretty much dominating the majority of the market. And you see that pretty much consistently across all the industries in the private sector, whether it's in any industrialization, in manufacturing, in financial services, but also in regular services as well. And the problem with that is, and I see some people nodding their heads in the audience because this is pretty much pervasive also in other countries in the region, but very much so in the Gulf. The problem with that is that there is huge economic efficiency losses that result from this type of structure. And because the states are welfare-based states, there's a lot of subsidies that go to people, but also huge subsidies that go to industries. So the larger beneficiary is really these industries, and then the benefit from them is basically they have higher profits than otherwise they could. So it's not that it's reducing their costs, they're just really increasing their profits. And that is a huge, again, loss in economic efficiency. And just to demonstrate the effects of regulating that and limiting that, I'll point your attention to the other graph on the slide, which is on your right-hand side. This is, actually if I might stand just to see it. So this is looking at effects of GDP from different reforms, decline in subsidy reform, but also oil price declines in the current, no sorry, this is only oil price declines in the current economic structures, also using data from Kuwait. And if you see the red line at the bottom, this is under oligopolistic structures. So if you have large improvements of oil price or huge declines in oil prices, we're not going to have huge improvements in GDP. However, if we imagine that there is a new policy that basically targets or regulates these oligopolistic industries, then you see the dotted line at the top where even if there is a decline in oil price, there could still be improvements in GDP, because all the benefits that's been captured from regulating these industries is then redistributed to the rest of the economy and to the people. So, and that also could be then reduction in subsidies from the government that's given to these industries, and all this extra funds then could support energy transition projects, economic just transition projects, sustainability projects, etc. And we can pull down the slides if you want. Thank you very much for that. And then I think that's pretty much it for me. If I missed anything else on my notes, sorry. That will be good. And then I think the last point that I want to mention on that, really kind of like a final takeaway, is putting all of these things together, and what does it mean then for policy making going forward? One of the problems as an applied economist that I face working in the region is the lack of data, or if the data are available, the lack of access to the data. The data are not given very freely and easily. And the difficulty with that is then we also, there, in my opinion, limited evidence-based policy making in the region. And what that means is we hear about policies, for example, let's reduce subsidies, as you mentioned, Hamad, without really realizing the actual effect of these reduction of subsidies on the different industries, on different people from different household levels, whether it's different nationalities, of course, but also, you know, women versus men. But this is really going to be increasingly important, particularly in the context of the energy transition, which is the main point of the conference, because if we don't know where the negative effects will be, then how can we then design policies to minimize these negative effects and mitigate them? And ideally, I think more studies that are really evidence-based are really necessary for the region to maximize the benefits of the energy transition and minimize the negative effects of that. And I will be very happy to answer any questions after that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Manal. I think you raised the issue of the welfare type of system, and who is it affecting and who is benefiting these big, you know, 2 or 3 companies that end up benefiting from these policies. And I think we can definitely raise this issue. We welcome any questions either online or here from the floor. And from, yes, Sari?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Really, very insightful. There is a lot of commonality on top-down policy. I mean, looking to Europe today, most of I mean, what is new sociologically is a community which exit from cities and go to rural area and started completely alternative project in rural area. I mean, and then of course you have the political economy and political system. A Green Party is there, try to push for energy transition and something like that. But my question to you, I mean, what is the major factors impeding this exit strategy? Because this exit strategy is something extremely noticeable now. I mean, in national conference of National Sociological Association, wherever I go in the last 3-4 years, there is a keynote topic about this community. So it's something really new, mushrooming in the last 10 years. I mean, is there a possibility of, I mean, of course there is a possibility, but what is the major factors? And my last point to the Omani paper, just a methodological one. I think we will find always discrepancies between ILO statistics, especially in employment, and other statistics, whether come from World Bank or another. And I do understand ILO to standardize their criteria of collecting, but we need absolutely what we call the relaxed definition and not a strict definition of ILO. So I think we should see what definition which fit more to the type of employment, to the type of sectors that exist, enable, if you like, to qualify these 2 figures. We need to qualify our figures. Thank you.
Yes, we'll take one more question, Maha, and then we will have answers from the panelists.
Yes, thank you for the interesting interventions. We heard from you that the GCC are still heavily dependent on fossil fuel, and even the Great Green Project are state-held. My question is, or what I wonder about, how serious GCC in transitioning to renewables, especially that we saw that Europe is going through an energy crisis because of the Russia and Ukraine war, and which drove oil prices higher. So this is my question to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maha. Elias? الميكروفون، على الميكروفون لأنه في ترجمة. وإذا فيك تقدم حالك.
الياس بن عمار، عضو مجموعة العمل من أجل ديمقراطية الطاقة تونس. أشكر المتدخلين على العرض اللي قدموه واللي أعطونا معلومات إضافية على منطقة ربما نجهلها على مستوى المعطيات والبيانات في مجال الطاقة. أنا عندي ملاحظات في شكل أسئلة في شكل ملاحظات. أولا إشكالية دول الخليج، وهنا سأتساءل إلى أي مدى يمكن أن نحصل على تغيير جذري في مجال الطاقة في دول الخليج. الإشكالية أنه في العالم سواء في دول الشمال أو حتى في دول الجنوب هناك مجتمع مدني ضاغط من أجل تحول أو انتقال طاقي عادل. هذا غائب في دول الخليج، وهذا هو الإشكال اليوم. الإشكال أنه كيفاش في دول الخليج نعمل كونفرجنس ما بين المجتمع المدني الدافع لحقوق الإنسان، الدافع للحريات السياسية، والمجتمع المدني المتخصص في مجال البيئة. أظن أن هذا مهم في دول، خاطر في دول الخليج اليوم أولا مثلا ناخذ عمان، أين التقاليد النقابية؟ غير موجودة في دول الخليج تقاليد نقابية تخلي أنه العمال سواء كانوا المقيمين المواطنين أو حتى المهاجرين ينجموا يدافعوا على حقوقهم وينجموا يطرحوا هالأسئلة هذه، لأنه ونعاود في العالم الحركة النقابية مساهمة مع الحركات البيئية من أجل تغيير أو من أجل انتقال طاقي عادل. هذه أول الملاحظة الأولى. الملاحظة الثانية، لازم أنا قدامي كان دوكيمون وثيقة على مساهمة مواطني الدول في الانبعاثات الغازية. ثلاثة مواطنين على رأس القائمة: المواطن القطري، المواطن الكويتي، والمواطن السعودي. ولهنا نتساءل على نموذج الاستهلاك اللي موجود في دول الخليج، لأنه اليوم إذا مش نحكيه على انتقال طاقي عادل، نحن ديما نمشيو للإنتاج. لابد من تغيير نمط الإنتاج. ليه؟ نمط الإنتاج، حتى تغيير نمط الإنتاج غير قادر على وقف التغيرات المناخية. لابد من تغيير نمط الاستهلاك أيضا. نمط هذا ثم الشعار الكبير اللي تعملت عليه الثورة الصناعية، أنه الإنتاج لازم يتبع الاستهلاك، الإنتاج يلبي الاستهلاك. هذا نمط غلط. لابد اليوم من باراديغم جديد، نموذج جديد للاستهلاك على حسب الموارد اللي موجودة في العالم الكل وليس اللي موجودة في الدولة. لأنه اليوم مثلا المواطن السعودي يقول لك أنا عندي طاقة نستهلك كما نحب. ليه؟ اليوم لابد من مقاربة عالمية في الاستهلاك. أنه ولهنا زاد فما مقاربة أخرى، سامحني نحل ربما قوسين، أنه يقول لك اللي يستهلك أكثر يدفع أكثر. لا، هذا خطأ. هذا خطأ، لأنه لهنا on va pénaliser les pauvres، معناتها الأغنياء يستهلكون والفقراء لا يستهلكون. هذوما زوج تساؤلات حول الموضوع. شكرا.
شكرا الياس. بفتكر حكينا عن الاستهلاك والإنتاج. يمكن منبلش كريستال إذا فيك if you want to respond to maybe Sari.
Thank you. I think I just want to make two small points that I think wrap together the conversation here and something I wanted to connect with Manal's presentation, and I think it speaks to some of your comments as well. The importance to not lose sight of the regional and global implications of these changes that we're talking about in this region. We often we talk about you know, the difficulty of the transition and the reliance on hydrocarbons, but all of these decisions and choices and ups and downs of the oil market have larger effects. And you pointed to that on the end. So on the inside, you need to look at the impact on the different social classes. I was glad you mentioned that. And then also, like I mentioned, on the implications on the wider region that is dependent through remittances or through other forms of ties. But also that also has to do with the environmental side. So in this pursuit for food security, for energy transitions, etc., the Gulf also reaches out to other regions. And so I think something I'd like to hear more from you is, when you're talking about food security, what about these, you know, land grabs and acquisitions in Egypt and other parts of the region where these massive investments and also very environmentally unfriendly processes are occurring? Your question about the exit strategy and the statistics is kind of connected to this as well. Well, statistics, yes, I gave 2 ranges. Of course, I can give you the definitions, and the Omanis also break it down by education level, etc. In general, even with the range and even with the different definitions, there is a problem there. And I think that was more my point, that there, or even when they diminish it and say it's a very small percentage of job seekers, it is a pressing social policy issue, and you can see that by the reactivity of the government in the kinds of policy changes, or when they make some kind of subsidy reform or a labor market issue, and then they roll it back very quickly from social pressure. The exit strategy, it really, I think, has to do with the volatility of the oil market. You see serious attention when there's a lot of pressure, and we have to see what happens now in this most recent increase of oil prices, but you start to see very easily fall back into these patterns of reliance on a very, what feels then to be a more secure form of income generation.
Maybe to Muhammad, you know, this question, I think it was raised also from the floor and others, is the Gulf reaching out to other parts, Egypt, Yemen even. And you also mentioned Iraq and Iran as well.
Yeah, so this one. Yeah, on regional cooperation, I sometimes call it regional environmental cooperation, regional environmental peace. It's really important. It was mentioned, I think, by Manal about consequences of people migrants coming out of the Gulf. We had this, Mossad certainly remembers when millions of Yemenis in the 1990s came to Yemen. The environmental footprint and the social footprint of this event, we are suffering from it until today. I mean, I can go on what happened after that, but this is really significant. So the Gulf, if you calculate the GDP of all the Gulf, I think this is the 3rd biggest GDP block in the world. So this is very important for migrant workers and so on. For achieving food securities, I think for long term, for let's say environmental security, if we define it like this, also supply security of water, we have to have regional cooperation among Gulf riparian littoral states, including Iran. Iran is 80 million. This is as much as the Gulf countries. Iran has not utilized many of the Gulf resources in the south. They are now starting. Imagine if Iran really puts money after the sanction relief there. We have to have cooperation, and there's only one convention involving all countries, the Kuwait Convention on Marine Biodiversity and so on. On food security, I mean, we had an experience with this in Qatar, the boycott, yeah. And sometimes I tell my students it's like this. For me, I know I'll be criticized, but we need trade. We need good relations in Africa and so on to achieve food security. It's like somebody rob you with a gun and you are afraid and you call the police, yeah? And the police came in 2 minutes. Yeah? Would you after that buy a gun? I tell you, in Qatar, we bought a gun. We started to, actually, the police came in the right time. So the insurance through international, we didn't have any disruption of supply in Qatar through international relations with Iran, with Turkey, with other countries. So it saved Qatar. But still, we said, let's put a lot of money, because politically it is convenient, I have to say it, always to say food security, after any crisis. We had it in the, we have it in Saudi Arabia, and we know in the north, the groundwater, how much it was depleted in Saudi Arabia. So food securitization, I mean, we have the national food security strategy, and it doesn't say we should be, we should store cereals, and we should not be self-sufficient on red meat. But still, we did it after the crisis because of fear, I think. So we need this trade relationships. I think, for example, countries with high arable percentage of arable land, Sudan. Why cannot Sudan be, a food basket for the Arab world through regulated good way? Maybe one last point. Regional cooperation in the Gulf. Maha, you asked a question about, are they serious? Yes, about renewables, very serious. It is very important thing. They have to keep exporting. It is the rentier state at stake. Are they serious about the energy transition? I tell you something, I'm not sure about this. There was a regional cooperation agreement to the GCC to have nuclear energy use, peaceful nuclear energy use for the Gulf countries. What happened? It didn't materialize. The Emirates built their nuclear plant. It will be the Baraka. It is 5% of the total energy mix by 2050. 5%. In my opinion, I wrote about this. They could have switched it with renewables. It is cheaper and so on. So why nuclear energy? It is geopolitical. So is this serious? I don't know. It's for you to judge.
I will offer a slightly different opinion. I think, in my opinion, the UAE has shown the largest, just picking up on the answer to Maha's question, has shown maybe the most progress towards its own goals. So I think now it's probably between up to maybe close to 12% of energy generation that's been from renewables. With the rest of the Gulf states, all the other 5, it's still less than 1%. So in my opinion, even though the targets, for example, in Kuwait, it's 15% by 2030, in Saudi, it's about, I think from memory, about 45 or so in 2050. So we still have time until these targets are new, but the progress to date towards these targets is very behind. So that then again brings a question about, are we serious about the renewable energy in the region? And the reason I say that, because the renewable energy is mostly for domestic consumption. And I still believe that the larger driver in the energy transition and even economic diversification plans has been to target the export market. The renewable energy is really for domestic consumption, to reduce domestic consumption and free up some of the available resources for export. Now, with the Ukraine crisis, with the hike in energy prices, one would think that there would be, because there's a large spike, of course, in export rents, a lot of this extra rent could then be taken and maybe funneled towards accelerating energy transition projects. But historically, that hasn't been the case. Historically, when you have a rise in energy prices, the funds then basically get distributed to people and to industries, and also there's more investments in upstream, so which means, to get more output out, and that is then contrary to the decarbonization targets. So I think there is that conflict there, and I think the proof will be in the pudding with more time, because the time for the target, so to speak, hasn't come, and that we'll have to, I think we'll have to wait and see. But going back to the second question by Mr. Elias, I think it's also important, and as we've talked about that earlier in the opening remarks, that also efficiency measures will really be very, very important for reducing not just the energy consumption, but also the emissions and carbon footprint, but also other little things like, you know, reducing the thermostat in the rooms from you know, constantly being at 18% summer and winter to making it, you know, 23%. You know, those little changes are actually significant in reducing energy consumption, and behavior is extremely important. In the summer, when a lot of people leave, the houses are still running with full air conditioning. And we also have to say that consumption, I think, of course, it's partially people's choices, but also it's been really supported by the policies that have allowed access to almost free energy and free water for decades, and only after the 2014 decline in oil prices that there was subsidy reform. So it's more of a, you know, a bit also a chicken or the egg question, because the policy is going to be important in reducing or affecting change in behavior and in consumption and in efficiency measures, but also people's choices and awareness are going to be also important. I just have a quick couple of points going to the earlier, I think it was Mr. Seti, was it, on the employment a bit. I will not talk about Oman because that's not really my expertise, but in other countries, and I'll mention examples from Kuwait, there is disguised unemployment. A lot of people working in the public sector where we think that they are employed because they earn income, but actually sometimes you have 4 people, 5 people for the same job. And you go to ministries sometimes and people don't have seats to sit. Sometimes they come, clock in, and then leave. So if there is a real reform in the social contract or in the welfare state or in trying to move people out of the public sector towards the private sector, then a lot of these people will have to be, will have to join the workforce in the private sector. They will have to replace some of the foreign labor already, because there's no new positions and no new industries and productive capacity, but also they'll have to be retrained. So the employment bit is a bit tricky because it's not just a matter of who's not working. And it was interesting during COVID that we saw a rise in quote unquote the gig economy, people making cupcakes at home and people driving Ubers and things like that. And that also often is not necessarily shown in the actual statistics. So the employment bit is going to be difficult, but I think will be really very important. And the last bit on regional collaboration and imports, we also need to remember that the region doesn't only depend on imports for food security, but also imports for inputs in industrial production and other production. So when there's something that's being made, the input, the intermediates are being imported. So the energy transition, if there's any negative effects on the finances, so to speak, or then that would also affect because the price of these imports would then be higher, and then negatively then affect the hoped for economic diversification that has not been happening. And with the energy transition, a lot of the countries, for example, with hydrogen, we see Oman, we see Saudi Arabia, we also see the Emirates have announced hydrogen projects. Kuwait really wants to get into that decision, into that space. That requires a lot of investments, a lot of R&D. Instead of having the states compete with one another, there's also collaboration opportunities that they really join forces there. And of course, then that becomes a political question. But in theory, yes, collaboration would be very important and fruitful.
Okay, thank you. On that note, we have actually 2 questions online. I'm going to read them. To what extent are national security and/or regime security concerns hampering more effective regional cooperation on these issues? Are Gulf states insistent on national capacity and national resilience rather than shared capacity? And the second question, in your opinion, can a true energy transition happen without a deep transformation of all of the current economic and social systems prevalent in the GCC? And again, another question online. Are there alternative development pathways, studies, and scenarios already developed? Maybe Camille, we can start from you.
Yes, the first question. Yes, I will take it from the perspective of collaboration versus competition, and we're just talking about it. No, I think collaboration is not yet working in the region, not even within one country. I would say that what triggered and has driven the development of the region in the last 20 to 30 years is competition. Competition between city-states, competition between first Bahrain and Dubai, then Qatar and Dubai, then Abu Dhabi and Dubai, now that the UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai with Saudi cities. This is what is driving the development, maybe not in the right direction, but this is what driving development in the region. Another example is air companies. Gulf Air was an attempt of collaboration in airlines. It failed. The successes in airlines are Emirates and Etihad that are born out of competition. So you have two huge, and three with Qatar, huge international airports in a very tiny space, while Gulf Air aimed to become a global player in the airline industry. So again, a failure of collaboration and success, maybe in the wrong way, but success of competition and individual initiatives. It's the same within states. And if we look at real estate, for example, in Dubai, at the origin, now there are much more players, but at the beginning, you had two big players, Nakhil and Emitters. Nakhil was specializing in water canals and artificial islands, and Emitters was specializing in inland developments and high rises, with the ultimate example of Burj Khalifa. And for Nakhil, it's the ultimate example of the Palm Islands. So again, competition, not collaboration, and in my opinion, not for the best in terms of environmental impact, urban development, carbon footprint.
Crystal?
Okay. Well, hello? You here? Okay. Yeah. Well, those were really, I think, important questions, and ones that I couldn't even hope to have real, deep answers for, because I think this is what we're all grappling with at this moment. But they're really important ones. I think the question of national and regime security. I think most of us have been agreeing that this is one of the hindrances, and this is what also I think you were hinting at earlier about the exit strategy. These kind of drivers do impede these kinds of conversations. They do impede different transitions, and we've seen that at different historic moments and with different transitions that they've had to grapple with. I agree with what you're saying about collaboration. But the big question that came at the end about alternative scenarios, I think there are a variety that have drawn up, but I don't think they can occur, like the person who asked the question suggested, without really a radical transformation for the kind of system, not just within the region, right? So I'm not just talking about regime, social contract. I'm talking like a global, because these. At the end of the day, the political and economic system that underpins the Gulf is connected with a global capitalist system that underpins the world economy. And without a massive change in this front, I don't think it's actually really possible. You'll have piecemeal reforms and things that ebb and flow with different energy prospects at the moment, but unless there's some kind of broader systemic change, I don't see that happening just within a regional space.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Mohammed or Manal? Yeah.
The visions are in a way, even though there's been 5-year development plans for decades, but the new visions are in a way kind of an alternative, a development pathway that's been also presented. But I think one of the challenges, in my opinion, a lot of the policy making and even the reforms are really very short-term looking, not very long-term looking, and that also then really reduces their effectiveness and the extent to which then they can really drive significant change, because certain things that have also been there, certain attitudes, certain relations between, you know, the state and the people, or the state and the government, etc., that have been there for generations, we also can't just expect that this will change in really, you know, a couple of years. So if we don't take a long-term approach to policy and reform and really make it even at, you know, levels of education and levels of families, etc., then and behaviors and then and expectations, then I think that would reduce the effectiveness of that as well. But just a quick comment on your example of Amar and Nakhil. That's also really the rent-seeking behavior with these oligopolies that I was mentioning. And this is the kind of competition that really then takes away from a lot of the resources. And there's just, you know, looking again at the short term. How can we maximize profit-seeking from the existing rents rather than the longer term development, because the private sector still looks for the state as really the father figure, so to speak, rather than say, we're going to drive innovation, we're going to do different things, etc. Mohammed, to you.
Thank you a lot. I think too many interesting ideas. Maybe to the question was asked, will we have a real serious, is it true what's happening? I think it is, most things are gray. They are not black and white. I mean, what is a region that has a perfect energy transition? I am German, I'm European, proud. I'm also Arab, proud. But is Europe a good example for energy transition? I mean, we can talk a lot about it. I mean, now the question I think was asked also by Maha, our Iraqi colleague. By the way, yesterday I forgot to mention a new news. Iraq has expected 10% GDP increase. Congrats. This is exactly what will happen in the Gulf countries in the next years with higher revenues. It will hinder the energy transition, and we'll have the same story. So, okay. We cannot, it's true what Elias said, absolutely. Without civil society, without really a change in mind from below, a radical change. I show my students what happens in Europe in the 60s and 70s with the protests, and I tell them, this is how the Green parties evolved. This is how this global civil society evolved. This is how change happened. Yeah? We are very far from this. This is not happening in the Gulf. But the Gulf is important. We should not discount it. Gas is very important interim energy source. Switching to gas is a part of the energy solution, and the Gulf can provide it. Qatar can provide cleaner energy. Qatar has the capacities, and so we should not look at it as. Of course, Gulf countries, they care about images. They care about the faith. This has hindered sustainability with extravagance and so on. But now, also because it is plain, we see here, everybody says the Gulf. I don't believe them. Yeah, and this pushes them also to become more sustainable, because a modern city cannot be Dubai cannot say we are the global modern city, and they don't have green buildings and these kind of interventions.
Maybe Mohammed has already mentioned that it's not clear. There is no black and white answer. But first of all, thank you so much for your presentations. Okay, now. Thank you for your presentations. My question is not specific. Maybe it's open questions. But based on your experiences in different Gulf countries, and also based on the changes happened last years in the Gulf countries, and the new plans and visions they have, and with regardless any new circumstances that might happen in the coming years, where do you say the Gulf countries in 20 years from now? I mean, there is no specific answers, but from your expectations, is it going to be, and to what extent they are going to be successful in the three fields: economic, environmental, and employment transitions? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Musa'ad. I'm going back to Crystal because she wanted to comment on that point.
But it's very connected, so it's perfect. I can address both. No, I just wanted to, I guess, respond to something Manal said, but kind of separate two things. The one is, yes, I think there are real alternatives, there are real things happening. It's not to say that, but if you're talking about a systemic change that's actually transformative, that talks about bottom up, that talks about civil society, so, you know, all of these things, that is something that requires something at a global level. That's what I mean. But the point that you raised about the visions, I wanted to make, I'm a bit more cynical about them. Of course, you mentioned we have this longer history of the 5-year plans, but we also have an example of a long-term vision. So I'll go back to the case I talked about. Oman had the first long-term vision in 1995 that brought you to 2020. And if you look at and that was a very laid out one. It wasn't one like the current ones with bullet points that talk about green energy and shiny futures. And even that one, there's many of the points there that years after 2020 we haven't quite reached. So I think there's ambitions, I think it's important, I think it gives some things to drive towards, but at the same time you see with the dependence on oil revenues, the seriousness with which plans are followed goes up and down. So that's kind of my answer to your 2020. This, if you're talking about real systemic change or these incremental ones, I can leave the predictions to my economist colleagues who are still willing to make future predictions. I am not.
Yes, I would like to just add to what you're saying. You were talking, Manal, about short-term sight. I think, and I'm also cynical, that these long-term visions are developed for short-term gains on the diplomatic arena, unfortunately. And for the bottom-up and civil society, yes, most policies in the Gulf are still, or at least in, maybe not in, less so in Oman, but are top-down in all sectors, including culture. But increasingly, you have awareness within the local community and the expat community about the environmental problems and climate change that we're going through globally. And I think that cannot be ignored, and that is not ignored anymore. It's one of the elements that is also starting to drive environmental policy in the region. We cannot anymore just pour concrete on the whole coastline as we did in Dubai. It's not easy to do anymore. You have to think twice before doing it, for example. Now there are always still ways to market it from a greenwashing perspective, and this still works, unfortunately, but less so.
Okay. Thank you, Camille. Maybe the last comment from Manal and Muhammad.
So I will not give you actual numbers and predictions. Economists, I guess, have a history of also proving themselves to be wrong a lot of times anyway. But in terms of what's happening in 20 years, I think there's a disconnect between governments and or industries and also people and social level as well. I do agree that it's still top-down approach for reform and change, and we see in lots of industries and different banks across the region, for example, trying to achieve net zero emissions at their industry level. In Saudi Arabia, there's also mandates for different industries to achieve that. So they're working towards that, and again, this is a mandate for them, and there are KPIs and things that they have to meet. But then in terms of the other vision, in terms of do we have a productive society, do we have an innovative society, do we have a green society, these I think are a lot more complex, and I think in my opinion, under the current policies, in 2020 will not necessarily be significantly different unless there are real changes there. And my last closing point relates to the question on civil society by Mr. Ilyas, that we also need to remember the particularities of the region, that civil society doesn't always demand exactly the same thing as civil society in other regions. In Kuwait, for example, where it does have more of a vibrant civil society than the rest of the Gulf, in my opinion, just because of their slightly more quasi-democratic system, people want to consume energy, cheap energy, and they want continued access to subsidies, and they don't necessarily want, for them, democracy is one thing, but access to clean energy and their ongoing welfare and their ongoing consumption patterns is another. So that also is something that we can't just take for granted and say whatever happens elsewhere might necessarily be in the region. I think we need to respect the particularities there. تفضل.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think underneath the service, you will, in 30 years, underneath this, you will see the same mindset. I don't see awareness. I think awareness is increasing, but very slightly. I work a lot with the students, and yeah, it's better. If you go outside, they will tell you sustainable what? Never heard of it. Yeah, they will still have water, aqua park in the desert from groundwater that's depleted. Crazy things. Yeah. And the political systems, the social contract is the same, and I don't see, let's say, change that way. It is this underneath. On the service, if you look at the indicators, we will have certainly renewable energies. The national visions are important to push renewable energies. Saudi Arabia, look, solar energy is cheap. You can afford it. You put a couple of billion US dollar from the subsidies there, and you have it in 2 or 3 years utility scale, and you put it to the grid. It's very easy. So we will have high, I'm very optimistic, high percentage. In Qatar, it's a small country, you only need 1 or 2 utility scale, and you will already have 20-30% of electricity coming from renewables. You will have energy certification of buildings. We will have more public transport using electricity. On the service, we will have a lot of these, what we call ecological interventions. Yes.
Thank you. I think this is a good way to end this panel. It has been very delightful to be moderating, and thank you so much for your interventions, for being with us. I mean, as we discussed even yesterday, it's a very top-down. I mean, when we talk about GCC, but we've also discussed yesterday and today and in the next panel discussions, the role of the state and how it's completely disconnected from the people. We've also discussed about awareness. I mean, is our behaviors changing in the region, yes or no? And how we can create these movements. You've compared it as well with energy democratization in Tunisia. And I think this is a good way for us within our environmental politics program to continue asking these questions and these debates and really identifying these local voices that we want to bring to the table and be critical about the different questions about the Gulf. And on that note, I think we will take a break and we will come back with another panel discussion on the energy transition, but this time in North Africa, moderated by our colleague Malak Lakhal. And 4 panelists from North Africa will be joining us. And I would like on that note also to thank Majd, who has been with us online, who is not today with us, but she's our wonderful colleague from Saudi Arabia who's been supporting us and who couldn't make it to Beirut. So she's with us online. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in about 20 minutes.